is Jose Reyes, and this was a quick 1 minute video for all you to have a quick understanding on what boarding schools were. And we will continue to talk about what boarding schools are and how they affected Indian Americans for the bad. And we are also here to talk about the educational history of Indian Americans.
My name is Oscar Ruiz, and Jose will start us out by introducing the topic assimilation.
Many people don't know the meaning of the word assimilation. The word assimilation is when you are absorbed into something. In this case, the meaning is being absorbed into a new culture, religion, race, and school, and you have no say in it. This is a picture of an Indian American boarding school. Boarding schools were a type of concentration camps, but without as many deaths as a Jewish concentration camp or a Japanese internment camp. Jewish concentration camps were a form of punishment that was formed only for the Jews, where Germans tried to take everything from the Jews just like Americans try to take everything away from Indian Americans. And not many people know about Japanese internment camps, but they were a type of punishment that had happened right after the invasion on Pearl Harbor. The way Americans would do it was basically, if you were or looked Japanese, then you would be punished. And if you would try to hide, the government would try to search for you. All these forms of punishments were for different religion, culture, but all three were definitely a nightmare in their own way.
Indian Americans had it incredibly hard. They were being put down because of their culture and how they looked like. Native Americans were the first people that set foot on this land of the free, and were being imprisoned for being who they are. We will later go on to talk more about this subject and their punishments and the hard obstacles they had to go through in order to be where they are now.
Kill the Indian in him and save the man. This call was mainly towards the young Indian Americans because in the government's mind, they thought that by going after the youth, it would carry on for generations to come. It was like a cycle. What the government meant by this call was to them being Indian was horrible, just like how the government or America in general thought it was horrible to be Latino and African American. So the government tried everything to make sure there was no more Indian, just American.
So as we previously mentioned, the word assimilation means when you're absorbed into something, a certain religion, race, and so on. It can also mean to be similar. So assimilation was connected to boarding schools because boarding schools were just schools that taught you to be American. And it's crazy because what does it mean to be American? To be Christian, educated, to look white? That was the government's goal of boarding schools, for Indian Americans to be Christians, to be educated, and basically be white.
When children would be sent to school, they would have to cut their hair very short, and that was already taken away a part of them because to Indian, hair represents a physical manifestation of the growth of the spirit, and some say it allows for extrasensory perception and connection to all things. Then the school would go on to talk about how they were going to force them into Christianity and take their culture away from them. Many children died at boarding schools, and how their school was susceptible to deadly infections such as the flu and tuberculosis. Most of the boarding schools were very unsanitary. The schools would carry around diseases like tuberculosis and the flu. As we all know, back then in the late 1800s to early 1900s, having any of those two illnesses was almost a guaranteed death. Since we didn't have the medicine nor technology to find out how to cure those illnesses.
When it was time for kids to go to boarding schools, it was like when African Americans would be slaves. They didn't want to go, but they had no choice but to go. When Indian Americans left, they couldn't pick what school they wanted to go to. They were forced to go, and if they didn't want to, the government would go looking for them. When the children were taken away, they weren't just being taken for a year or a semester. They would be taken for years. Children would be alone without their family growing up in what is basically a prison. We are now about to talk about the obligations the school had for Indian American students in boarding schools.
Boarding schools forbid Native Americans such as using their own language and names and how they weren't allowed to practice their religion and culture. Boarding schools were trying to change anything that was Indian related that included language, names, religion, culture, and appearances.
There was a case in the 1880s where 3 children from the northern Arapaho tribe by the names of Little Chief, Horse, and Little Plume were killed at Pratt's Carlisle Indian Industrial School in the 1880s. They were killed because they gave each other those nicknames. When Indian Americans spoke their language or embraced their culture or even practiced their religion, they would get beaten, embarrassed, and humiliated. humiliated in front of the whole class.
Not only were children killed for giving each other those nicknames, but when Indian Americans would first enroll to the school, the government forced them to change their name, which all plays a part into taking away Indian and saving the man. Names meant a lot to Indian Americans just like they would mean a lot to any other people. Because when one gives a child a name, it means something to them. They don't just put it on a child for no reason. These names were given to Indian Americans as a representation of who they were, and their names had a meaning. There was, in fact, children that would try to escape from boarding schools, but there was no clear background on if they actually successfully escaped, and there was no research done on what the punishments were for those that escaped. Indian Americans suffered a huge case of PTSD, and how could they not suffer a case of PTSD? They would go through a lot. Indian Americans had to live with this trauma for the rest of their lives, and they carried on to their children and their children's children. So in other words, America did achieve their goal of killing the Indian, but they didn't keep their word about saving the man. To begin with, there was nothing to save. They were perfectly fine before any of the things they had to go through, but Americans left Indians feeling empty. It destroyed them physically, but most importantly, emotionally. Because physically, you can always be fixed, but emotionally, mentally, that is something that can never be fixed. When Indian Americans left boarding schools, as one can imagine, they were traumatized. Many of the Indian Americans have said it themselves that boarding schools took everything away from them. The schools took their childhood away because when you're a children, you shouldn't be worried about being killed or being sick or being beaten or being embarrassed or humiliated in front of everyone. When one is a child, all they have to worry about is what's for dinner or which one of the toys they're gonna play with. When one is a child, they shouldn't be separated from their families. They need to stay with their families because that's all they have. When one is a child, they shouldn't know what pain is and suffering feels like. No one should, but much less a kid who has no experience with life. Boarding schools were meant to make Indians feel or be more American, but it failed.
When former boarding school students would have a family of their own, they knew nothing but suffering and hate. Most Indian Americans became alcoholic and drug addicts in order to forget about suffering they had to go through at those schools. So what this meant was that with all the humiliation they went through in those boarding schools,
The Indians lost many of their people due to U.S. separating them apart because Indian Americans had no other option but to do what the Americans would say. And others dying because of ridiculous things like giving each other nicknames and calling each other by their names. Nothing that they did had a good outcome. It just really seemed like the worst, and it also looks bad on behalf of Americans.
some Indian Americans committed suicide because of all the trauma they had because of the boarding schools, and that, as we all know, would take a huge toll on the family. Not only leaving families hurt, but it would also lead to their children committing suicide. Because the sad reality about suicide is that if one person that means a lot to you does it, then you are in so much pain that you take your own life away. And it all goes back to the same topic, which is the boarding schools.
No human being should be treated unfairly due to their background. Every human being has the rights to do the same thing as any other person, whether white or of color. In this time, the U.S. had no equality with the Native Americans, not even the children. Everything was just so unfair and left nothing but bad memories.
What the United States did to the Indians was very unfair, and just seeing and learning about every single thing that the United States, the land of the free, did to them is just so sad, and it was very unfair how they were treated and how traumatized they were after all the U.S. put them through.
The U.S. government eventually terminated more than 100 tribes by revoking their status as sovereign, dependent nations and ending all forms of federal aid associated with that destination. This led to the relocation of the Native Americans to relocated urban areas. Also, they offered job training and housing assistance to those Native Americans who migrated to San Francisco, Denver, Minneapolis, and other cities. In simplest words, they were moving, relocating, and were being encouraged by getting offered a job and housing assistance. For example, they would take this offer because it would benefit them by helping them with a lot with that, and they knew very well they needed help. We have 10 questions for you guys to answer. So basically, you don't have to write them out in full sentences, but that was our presentation.